On a Tuesday morning in September of 2013, a delivery driver named Marcus Iglesias backed a flatbed truck up to a barn on the edge of a 40-acre property in Nelson County, Kentucky, and watched a woman in her late 30s sign the delivery manifest for 11 spent bourbon barrels without so much as glancing at the stack already sitting behind her barn, 3 high and easily 200 deep, running the full length of the structure and disappearing around the back corner into the tree line. Marcus had been hauling loads for Ashford Reserve Distillery for 6 years by that point, and he had dropped barrels at scrapyards, at landfill transfer stations, at a handful of craft breweries that wanted them for aging beer. He had never dropped them at a place that already looked like this. He asked her, because he couldn't help himself, what she was planning to do with all of it. She told him she was still figuring that part out. He looked at the stack again, easily 600 barrels by his rough count, oak staves gone silver gray with age and weather, iron hoops rusting at the seams, and he told her that was an awful lot of barrels for a woman who was still figuring it out. She said most good plans started that way. He signed off on the delivery, drove back to the distillery, and told 2 other drivers about the barrel woman out on Cardwell Lane, and neither of them thought much of it, because barrels piling up behind a small operation wasn't unusual. What was unusual, though nobody there yet had a reason to notice it, was that the pile behind Renee Ashcroft's barn had been growing steadily for 4 years already, and it was about to start shrinking for the first time. Let me tell you about Renee Ashcroft, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she built, and you need to understand what she built before you can understand why furniture buyers from 3 states away now call her workshop directly instead of going through a showroom. Renee was born in 1975 in Bardstown, Kentucky, the unofficial bourbon capital of a state that considers bourbon close to a civic religion, and she married a cabinetmaker named Todd Ashcroft in 1998, a quiet, careful man who ran a small custom furniture shop out of a converted barn on 40 acres his family had owned since the 1950s. Todd built kitchen cabinets and dining tables and the occasional built-in bookshelf for clients around Nelson and Washington counties, a modest, steady business that paid the bills without making anyone rich, and Renee kept the books and raised their son, Caleb, and helped in the shop when Todd needed an extra pair of hands sanding or finishing. Todd Ashcroft died of a heart attack in the shop in March of 2009, at age 36, found by Renee when she came out with his lunch. He was 34 years old. Renee was 33, with a 6-year-old son and a shop full of half-finished orders and tools she knew how to use only well enough to help, not well enough to run the business alone. She spent the better part of a year deciding whether to sell the equipment and close the shop for good, and what kept her from doing it, she would say later, was less a grand plan and more a simple unwillingness to let the last thing Todd built sit empty and quiet. By 2010, Renee had taught herself, slowly and through a combination of trial, error, and evening classes at a community woodworking co-op 2 counties over, enough to keep the shop running on small custom orders. It was not thriving. It was surviving, the way a lot of small rural craft businesses survive, on thin margins and word of mouth, and one of the biggest costs eating into those margins was lumber, specifically the kind of dense, character-rich hardwood that Todd's old clients had come to expect and that Renee was now paying full retail price for, because she had none of her late husband's supplier relationships and none of his ability to source material cheap. Let me tell you about the bourbon barrel problem in Kentucky, because you need to understand the scale of it before you can understand what Renee saw in it that almost nobody around her had bothered to look at closely. Under federal law, bourbon must be aged in new, charred oak barrels, which means every single barrel used to age bourbon in Kentucky can legally be used exactly once for that purpose before it's retired. Kentucky distilleries produce and empty out enormous numbers of these barrels every year, and while a meaningful secondary market exists for them, sold onward to Scotch and rum producers, hot sauce makers, and craft breweries looking to age beer in bourbon-soaked wood, that secondary market has never come close to absorbing the full volume. By the early 2010s, industry estimates put Kentucky's annual surplus of retired barrels, the ones nobody in the secondary aging market wanted, somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, and disposing of them was not free. Ashford Reserve Distillery, a mid-sized operation roughly 15 minutes from the Ashcroft property, was paying a private hauler by the barrel to landfill roughly 4,000 retired barrels a year that didn't sell into the aging market, a disposal cost that ran the distillery close to $11 a barrel once hauling and tipping fees were included. Renee found this out almost by accident, in the fall of 2009, sitting across a folding table from Ashford's operations manager at a county fair booth, making small talk while her son ran off with a lemonade. She asked him, mostly out of idle curiosity, what happened to all the empty barrels. He told her, with the flat, unbothered tone of a man discussing a cost line he'd long since stopped thinking about, that most of them went to landfill because nobody wanted them fast enough to keep pace with what the distillery emptied out. Renee did not have a business plan that afternoon. What she had was the beginning of an idea, the kind that sits quietly for a while before it turns into something. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many times have you sat across from someone explaining a cost they'd stopped questioning, a problem so ordinary to them that it had become invisible, and not thought twice about it? Because that is exactly the moment Renee Ashcroft was sitting in, at a county fair folding table in 2009, and the difference between her and everyone else who had ever heard Ashford's operations manager complain about barrel disposal costs was that she went home and did the arithmetic instead of forgetting the conversation by dinner. American white oak, the specific species used for bourbon barrels, is prized in furniture making for its tight, straight grain, its strength, and its rich color, and it typically retails, kiln-dried and milled, somewhere between $6 and $9 a board foot depending on grade and region. A single standard 53-gallon bourbon barrel, broken down properly, yields somewhere between 20 and 25 board feet of usable stave lumber, meaning a single barrel that Ashford Reserve was paying roughly $11 to landfill represented, in raw material terms, somewhere between $140 and $200 of retail equivalent hardwood, already aged, already weathered to a character and color that new lumber couldn't replicate, and already infused faintly with the smell and staining of the bourbon itself, a detail that would turn out to matter more to buyers than Renee initially expected. She approached Ashford's operations manager formally in the spring of 2010 and asked whether the distillery would let her haul barrels away at no cost to them, in exchange for taking whatever volume she could manage off their hands. He agreed within a week, because it cost the distillery nothing and saved them a portion of their hauling fees. Renee started with a borrowed utility trailer and hauled what she could manage after Caleb was in bed, 10 or 12 barrels at a time, stacking them behind the barn because she had far more coming in than she yet had the skill or capacity to process. By 2013, 4 years into the arrangement, the pile behind her barn had grown to the roughly 600 barrels that startled Marcus Iglesias on that September delivery, because Renee had been taking barrels faster than she could turn them into finished furniture, teaching herself the specific and unforgiving skill of breaking a curved barrel stave down into usable flat lumber, a process that required steaming or careful ripping to remove the curve without wasting the wood, something Todd had never done and that Renee had to work out largely through her own trial and error and a handful of video tutorials from other reclaimed wood makers around the country. Let me tell you about the moment this stopped being a quiet side project and became something the local furniture trade in Nelson County couldn't ignore. Gary Fenwick had run Fenwick Home Furnishings in Bardstown for 26 years by 2013, a well-regarded mid-size retailer selling traditional and custom furniture across 3 counties, and he was, by most accounts, a decent man and a shrewd businessman who had built a comfortable, well-established position in a market he understood thoroughly. In November of 2013, both Renee and Gary had booths at the Bluegrass Home and Garden Expo in Louisville, Renee's first time exhibiting at anything larger than a local craft fair, set up with 4 finished pieces, a dining table, 2 side tables, and a bench, all built from reclaimed bourbon barrel oak, the wood's characteristic dark staining and faint char lines visible along the grain in a way that made the pieces look, to anyone who stopped to look closely, unmistakably like nothing else in the hall. Gary Fenwick walked past her booth twice before he stopped. He looked at the dining table. He looked at the small hand-lettered sign explaining the wood's origin. He looked at Renee, and he said, not unkindly exactly, but with the easy confidence of a man who has spent 2.5 decades learning what sells, that it was a clever story, but that furniture buyers in that market wanted clean, consistent, predictable pieces, and that what she was selling looked, to him, like a craft project dressed up with a good backstory. He said the reclaimed wood market was a niche that came and went every few years and that she'd be better off finding a wholesale supplier and building something scalable instead of hauling barrels out of a distillery lot herself. 2 vendors at the neighboring booth, overhearing this, laughed, not cruelly, but comfortably, the way people laugh at something they find charming rather than threatening. Renee did not argue. She thanked Gary Fenwick for his opinion and went back to setting up her booth. That dining table sold on the second day of the expo, to a buyer from Louisville who paid $2,800 for it, more than 3 times what Renee had projected for her first major sale, specifically because the buyer, an interior designer working with a client who wanted something with a documented, tellable story behind it, said the barrel provenance was exactly what made the piece worth the price. Renee sold all 4 pieces at that expo. She drove home with $11,200 in orders, a number that, 4 years into hauling barrels on a borrowed trailer after her son's bedtime, changed the shape of what she thought the business could become. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because this is where Renee Ashcroft's operation stopped being a converted barn workshop and became something Nelson County could see clearly whether it wanted to or not. By 2015, Renee had hired her first employee, a young furniture school graduate named Dana Petrov who had grown up 2 farms over and had heard about the barrel workshop through her father, a former colleague of Todd's. Renee had also, by that point, formalized the arrangement with Ashford Reserve into a written agreement guaranteeing her first right of refusal on their annual barrel surplus, in exchange for a modest per-barrel handling fee that still cost the distillery far less than landfill disposal. She had developed a signature technique, milling barrel staves into wide plank panels rather than narrow individual boards, preserving the barrel's natural curve as a design feature in tabletops and headboards rather than fighting it, which gave her pieces a visual signature no other reclaimed wood maker in the region was producing. Her revenue told the story plainly by that point. In 2013, the year of the Bluegrass Expo, Ashcroft Reclaimed Oak, the name Renee had formally registered that winter, generated $18,400 in total sales. By 2015, with Dana Petrov on staff and 2 regional showrooms in Louisville and Lexington carrying pieces on consignment, revenue reached $61,000. By 2017, with a growing wholesale relationship supplying barrel plank material to 2 custom builders as far away as Nashville, revenue crossed $140,000, and Renee's barrel stockpile, which had once threatened to overwhelm her storage capacity behind the barn, was now being processed roughly as fast as it came in, with Ashford Reserve's full annual surplus, close to 4,000 barrels some years, running through her workshop on a rolling 12 to 18 month cycle from delivery to finished furniture. Gary Fenwick's showroom, meanwhile, was navigating a broader shift that had little to do with Renee Ashcroft directly and everything to do with a national furniture market increasingly interested in sustainability, provenance, and handmade character, categories that traditional mass-produced retail furniture struggled to compete in. By 2018, 2 of the 3 real estate agents who had once sent design-conscious clients to Fenwick Home Furnishings for custom orders were instead referring them to Ashcroft Reclaimed Oak, because those clients were specifically asking for reclaimed or storied materials, and Fenwick, as Gary himself would later admit, didn't do reclaimed. Let me tell you about the afternoon in the spring of 2019 that closed the loop on what had started at that trade show booth 6 years earlier. Gary Fenwick drove out to the Ashcroft workshop on a Thursday afternoon, the first time he had ever visited in person, and found Renee at the mill, breaking down a fresh delivery of staves. He stood in the doorway for a while, taking in the organized rows of milled barrel plank lumber, the finished pieces waiting for delivery, Dana Petrov running a panel through the planer at the far bench. He told Renee that he'd been watching his own referral numbers shift for 2 years and that he wanted to know whether she'd be interested in a wholesale arrangement, supplying reclaimed barrel oak panels to his showroom, which he would sell as a distinct product line alongside his traditional inventory. Renee looked at him for a moment. She told him she remembered him calling this a craft project dressed up with a good backstory. Gary Fenwick had the decency to look uncomfortable. He said he'd been wrong about that he'd spent 26 years learning what a predictable, established market wanted, and it had never occurred to him that the market itself could shift under him faster than his own instincts could track it. He said the barrels were only ever the raw material. What she'd actually built was a supply chain nobody else in the county had bothered to notice was sitting behind a distillery, free for the hauling. They signed a wholesale agreement that summer. It was not a large account relative to Renee's overall business by that point, but it was, as she told Dana Petrov afterward, the moment she understood the barrel pile behind her barn had stopped being a curiosity the county quietly gossiped about and had become something the county's own established furniture trade needed a relationship with instead of a joke about. Let me tell you where things stand now, because the story doesn't end with Gary Fenwick's visit, and the shape of what Renee built since then is the part that makes the whole 11 years make sense. By 2023, 14 years after that county fair conversation and 11 years into the formal barrel hauling arrangement with Ashford Reserve, Ashcroft Reclaimed Oak had processed just over 3,300 spent bourbon barrels, employed 4 people including Dana Petrov, who now managed production full-time, and generated annual revenue of just over $380,000, built almost entirely on raw material that a distillery 15 minutes down the road had once paid roughly $11 a barrel to send to landfill. Individual finished pieces, tables, benches, headboards, and a growing line of smaller items like cutting boards and serving trays made from offcut stave sections, sold at prices that reflected both the craftsmanship and the specific, tellable story buyers were paying for, with base per barrel equivalent material now commanding roughly $300 once milled and finished into smaller decorative and furniture components, a return on raw material that had once been considered a distillery's disposal problem. Caleb Ashcroft, 17 in the spring of 2023 and a senior at Bardstown High School, had been working weekends in the shop since he was 14, running the same planer his father, Todd, had once run in the same barn, learning the specific curved stave milling technique his mother had taught herself in the years after Todd's death, and had told Renee, without much fanfare, that he intended to study furniture design and small business management after graduation, with the plan of eventually running the workshop alongside her rather than leaving it behind. The barn itself looks almost nothing like it did on that September morning in 2013 when Marcus Iglesias stood at the edge of a barrel pile 600 deep and asked Renee what she planned to do with all of it. The pile is gone, replaced by an organized receiving yard where new barrel deliveries move through in a steady, managed rotation instead of stacking up faster than anyone can process them. Inside, the mill runs most weekdays, and the finished pieces waiting for delivery carry a small burned-in maker's mark on the underside, a simple oak leaf with the words Ashcroft Reclaimed, Bardstown, Kentucky, and, underneath it, the year the shop was founded by Todd, a detail Renee insisted on keeping even after the business had long since grown into something entirely her own. Renee Ashcroft signed for 11 barrels on a Tuesday morning in 2013 and stood next to a pile nobody quite believed she had a plan for. 11 years and 3,300 barrels later, the plant is the whole county's supply chain now, and the wood that once cost a distillery money to throw away sits in dining rooms 3 states from where it was aged, still faintly smelling, if you get close enough, of bourbon.